We are joined on the Daily Signal podcast today by former Governor Scott Walker, who now leads the Young America's Foundation as its president. Governor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you back at the Heritage Foundation. And, we are focused here in Washington on some of the big challenges our country faces. Obviously, the last 18 months, we've endured this pandemic. We now have a new administration in Washington, which is pushing a lot of big government socialist programs. You have a perspective as leading a state through some tumultuous times of your own, coming out of the recession and having some big budget debates and encounters with unions there. And now you're leading an organization that focuses on the future and educating young people about our great country. What is your outlook on our country right now as you interact with these young Americans and hopefully give them a brighter future as to what the days are ahead?
Well, I'm an optimist, which might sound unusual for a conservative here in our nation's capital where we sit right now. But I'm an optimist for a couple different reasons. One, you mentioned my time as governor. I think back, coming off the recession in 2008, 2009, going into 2010, like when I ran for governor, the unemployment rate surpassed 9.2% in Wisconsin. We had over 133,000 people out of work. We had all sorts of problems. I inherited a budget deficit of about $3.6 billion, which was, for a mid-sized state, a pretty significant amount. Reason I'm optimistic is because I look at, with positive conservative reforms, we were able to react to that in a great way. In fact, when I left for multiple years in a row, we had more people working than ever before in Wisconsin's history. Unemployment was well below 3%. We had budget surpluses every year we were in office. And probably most importantly, we put in place reforms that at both the state and the local level that allowed our elected officials, the people we duly elect, to actually run the governments, to get rid of the union control. That meant that we could staff based on merit, we could pay based on performance, we could put the best and the brightest in the classroom and elsewhere. And that's really paid off. More than $13 billion worth of tax relief, major reforms, major savings. So I put that in context as saying it hasn't happened yet, but I think that will have a major impact, particularly next year, on what happens with the electorate, and a minimum, at least with the House. And then I think, given time, much as we saw what happened in 2008 led to 2010 and beyond, the positive reforms that came after those elections, I'm hopeful that 22 and 24 will lead down that path as well. The other part is with young people. At Young America's Foundation, I just see not just our young people who are already motivated and involved, but when we go to college campuses and we give lectures, what I found is that many people look at young people today and they say, oh my gosh, what is wrong with them? And I say, no. What's wrong is that society, all of us collectively, haven't done enough to give a balanced perspective. And while on one hand that's frustrating because most polls then show that young people lean left, the positive side is, given some information, it's actually not hard to move them in the right direction.
Well, Governor, I will say that, as frustrated and as worried as people are today, I know that they still have hope for the future. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of them agree with your optimistic attitude. You are here at the Heritage Foundation today to talk about how we can effectively message to not only conservatives, but a lot of Americans who may not affiliate themselves directly with the conservative movement or agree with that label, but really, I think deep down probably agree with some of the issues that we work on. What advice would you like to share with our listeners about how you're doing that at Young America's Foundation?
One of the best things, and this is not only true with young people, I think it's true overall with people, but particularly young people, is, as conservatives, we have a tendency to think and talk with our head. The left thinks and talks with their heart. If we want to succeed, we need to think with our head, use our mind, but convey it in ways that come from the heart. And one of the most compelling things we encourage our young people to do at our conferences and even on their campuses is go and seek out people who've come here from other countries, particularly people who've come from places like Venezuela or Cuba or some of the old Soviet republics. We've had on our campuses and at many of our conferences people who fit that bill, whether they're very young or people who've several generations removed from having come here. But it's just so powerful. Because when someone talks to you about, Venezuela, a country that just a decade and a half ago was one of the wealthiest in the hemisphere, now 9 out of 10 people in that country live in abject poverty. In fact, so much so you can literally see that. I think the average Venezuelan in the last few years has lost something like 20 pounds just because of malnutrition. So you can literally physically see the impact of socialism on them. Or you think of Cuba, where up until last January, the minimum wage in Cuba was $17. Not per hour, not per day, not per week, but per month. Now it's gone up since then. But think about that. Even with free health care, and we all know that free health care means lousy health care in Cuba, as we've seen in this pandemic. But health care and housing and transportation, I tell these kids, $17, even at that, how would you even pay for your iPhone, let alone anything else? And so sharing not just the facts, but finding ways to communicate it either through stories or ideally through firsthand accounts of people who've experienced either socialism, socialist countries, or countries that were once communist. Really, really powerful.
I'm glad you talked about stories. I mean, that was one of the impetuses for us to create the Daily Signal, was to take some of the policy issues and put a human face on them. And then, as you mentioned, authenticity to the group you were speaking to, I think is really important. And so finding those individuals who can talk about it directly and their own experiences, great ideas. Now, let me ask you this. We have heard now for several years about through polling and other just anecdotal information that more and more young people are gravitating towards socialism. They're also turning away from free market capitalism, it seems. When you've looked at these issues, what do you find in the polling that you've done?
Well, on the surface, it might appear that way, but it's interesting. We did a number of polls on this, like others have done. But for example, one of the open-ended polls we did where we said, well, define socialism. The highest number of people, there was no clear majority, but the plurality at the top was not sure. Nearly 30% of the respondents of young people weren't even sure. Get this, a whopping 10% said they thought it was being social, which is amazing because the next two highest groups were both at 11%, where they actually gave pretty accurate descriptions. So about as many people just thought it was being social as anything else. Conversely, when we ask about free markets, very similar numbers. About 30% weren't certain, and they were kind of all over the map. So I go back to the good and the bad. The bad is we've got an education system in this country that largely has failed our students if they can't clearly define, whether you're for or against it, what socialism is and what free market capitalism is at. And that's one of the important things, too, is how do we define it? It's big government socialism versus free market capitalism, if you want to be clear about the parameters, because then I think it gets back to the fairness issue. Once we explain what that is, then young people go, oh, well, yeah, I'm actually for free markets. I don't want the government intervening in this. I don't want them telling me what I can or can't do. And one of the other interesting telling points in one of our polls was we asked, do you think the federal government is using taxpayers' money wisely? A mere 26% said yes, about half said no, and about a quarter weren't certain. So 3/4 of them were either no or weren't sure. Only slightly more than a quarter actually thought that they were using it right. So it is a telling issue that we need to go beyond just the superficial headlines that the media jumps over and realize that most young people either don't know or don't fully appreciate what socialism is.
Yeah, it makes you also wonder if the left is maybe overplaying its hand here.
Well, I think they are. Yeah. Well, I think they are, but they have a willing accomplice in the media.
True.
The media buys into this. I often say the left and the media are largely indistinguishable, but they buy into it. And I think that actually even worse with the media, it's not even just that they're liberal. I think some are, for sure, nationally. But I think worse than that, most media outlets are just lazy. They just... that's why they love talking about polls. They love talking about elections because what they really want to talk are easy, simple things. There's one to the other. It's why abortion and the death penalty get far more attention than what's actually in the $3.5 trillion spending spree, because those are black and white issues. Things that are a little bit more gray, that take a little bit more nuance and understanding, are largely difficult. And most anchors, most reporters don't want to expose themselves to how little they actually know about these issues.
Yeah. Well, and let's talk about issues just for a moment, because I'm curious, in your work at Young America's Foundation, what issues do you find are resonating most with college students these days? What are they interested in?
Well, interesting enough, it sounds like a process one, but the biggest thing is cancel culture. Students overwhelmingly, anywhere from center to right, maybe not the radical ones on the left, but center to right, understand and have largely experienced, whether it was a professor, and amazingly, we have on our tip line, YAF.org, we have YAF.org/tips. You can actually give us a tip if you're a college student or anyone else for that matter. It is amazing how many times we'll get tips recorded or otherwise where you have professors saying, hey, if you say you're pro-life, you're pro-gun, you're pro-Trump, whatever it might be, you're going to flunk out of class. I won't accept that. Well, that's a clear violation, from not only free speech, but an academic freedom standpoint. So we see it in the classroom. We see it with fellow students. We see it when speakers come to campus where they either outright won't allow them, or I remember in the past, for example, at the University of California, Berkeley, we were helping to bring in Ben Shapiro, and the university didn't technically block him in the purest legal sense, but they put restrictions like he couldn't be there after 3 p.m. They couldn't advertise. The students couldn't advertise for it. And oh, by the way, they had to charge a security fee that was multiple times more than they charged any other group on campus. We fought that. We ultimately won in court, just like we'll fight it anywhere in the nation. But it is mind-boggling when you think about free speech, when you think about this is something the Constitution guarantees, but it should be the most revered on our college campuses. Yet that's where it's most at risk. And so cancel culture, free speech issues really are top of mind. Then after that, then they want to talk about freedom, things that allow them to live in a free and just society. They're very interested in fairness. We shouldn't back away from that. Fairness and authenticity, I think, can really be on our side, but we've got to go, again, beyond the surface and really dig in and explain what that means.
Let's go back to cancel culture for just a moment. If we have college students who are listening to this podcast, or maybe parents or grandparents, what are the resources that Young America's Foundation can provide them? You mentioned the tip line. Can you talk about other things that you do to help them overcome some of the challenges they might endure?
Well, individual students, whether you're a member or not, you can join as a member too at yf.org, but whether you're a member, whether you're part of a chapter, or you're just a conservative student, a lot of times we'll work with other groups, College Republicans, Students for Life, you name it. We'll work with others because it's not just, you don't just have to be a member to be of interest to us, as well as educators. I would add it's not just students, but there are a significant number of professors and teachers, not only conservative ones, but just many who just want to be objective. And we will stand up and help and defend them. It's part of our long game plan to broaden out and reach to them as well as to more students. And we'll partner. We don't do it alone. We have great allies like Alliance Defending Freedom that helps us when we go to court. We have other legal allies along the way. We'll work with any other group on campus. Again, we have a longstanding tradition, for example, with campus speeches, with college Republican chapters. But if they come to us at yf.org, let us know. Again, even if you just want to do an anonymous tip, let us know about something happening or you want direct help. We'll take it on in a heartbeat.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your leadership of YAF. Earlier this year, you made the transition to become the organization's president, taking over for Ron Robinson, who had led the organization for over 4 decades. We're really grateful to Ron for being a great partner here with us at the Heritage Foundation. I know many of our Daily Signal listeners admire the work that you're doing for the exact reason I mentioned earlier. They have hope in the future. Why did you take the job? Obviously, there are some people who think, you should go back into public service and maybe run for another office. How do you want to leave your mark on the organization?
Well, I get asked about once a week if I'm ever going to run again. And you can tell I've thought about this answer is I'm a quarter century younger than Joe Biden. So I got plenty of time. But for the foreseeable future, at a minimum, I have a contract through 2025. I'm with Young America's Foundation, not only because Tonette and I, my wife and I, have been longtime supporters. We came to the ranch, the Reagan Ranch, which is one of the many things that YAF is involved with. We own and operate the ranch out in Santa Barbara. We came and visited 10 years ago. It was perfect timing because we were in the midst of the sandwich between the protests and the riots at our state capitol and the recall election. It was a great reminder that as beloved as Ronald Reagan is today, rightfully so, back in the prime of his presidency, he was under attack quite frequently. And so it was very reassuring to see if you're doing the right thing, you're going to face attack, and it put us in the right mindset. So ever since then, Tonette and I have been huge supporters. But when Ron Robinson has been there more than 4 decades, I mean, think about a tremendous legacy that he's built. Great staff, great supporters, great students, great alumni. When he came to me a couple of years ago after my 2 terms were up and said, would you be interested? His goal was to retire at the end of after the inauguration in 2021, which he did. He said, would you be interested? And I said, well, if you just want a caretaker, there's plenty of great talent within. Said, but if you and your board are interested in someone who wants to dramatically increase both the number of students we reach and how much sooner we reach them, then I'm interested. And the board said, and Ron said, absolutely. And so that's part of why earlier this year, after I took the position, we initiated what's called the Long Game. Again, yaf.org/long game. If people want a copy, the Long Game is really a 12-point action plan to reach not just more, but to reach every campus. So that we have an outlet to every student in the country, and to start younger. As we're in high school and college right now. I want to go into middle school and even give parents of even elementary school parents some support, and that means building alliances. That's why we love working with the Heritage Foundation, because even things like, for example, critical race theory, what I call government-sanctioned racism, is a good example. A lot of parents looking for information on that. Those are things we don't need to duplicate. We can work with young people and then partner with groups like Heritage to not recreate content, but actually disseminate some of the stuff that Heritage does with the students we're working with.
I've taken a look at the Long Game. I think I heard you mention it on the Fox News Rundown podcast, and it's great. I love the plan and wish you the best with implementing it. Let's talk about some of the programs that you have and you offer to students. So I'm quite familiar with your National Journalism Center, having coming from a journalism background myself. But you also put conservative speakers on college campuses all across the country. How does somebody go about getting involved with the Young America's Foundation?
Well, again, yf.org. You can become an individual member. You can join a chapter. You can say, hey, I just want to bring, I've got a conservative group on campus. Go to that same website and contact us. And we don't have, there's not a strict initiation. You don't have to be a YAF chapter, as we call them, to be able to bring a speaker. And tonight, for example, I'm headed off later to Catholic University, where we've got Ted Cruz and Michael Knowles hosting The Verdict, their podcast live in front of the student audience, along with Liz Wheeler. We were just in the University of Wisconsin and Texas A&M last week doing that. We've got all sorts of dynamic speakers, from names that are a treat to young people to names from the past that many of us love and still appreciate today. A guy like Art Laffer, 81, he's still knocking it out of the ballpark. Young people still love it when he comes on campus and talks about economic freedom and opportunity. So just tremendous opportunities. We are the largest group that brings student speakers on campus. And again, I mentioned before, our partner is Alliance Defending Freedom. Far too frequently, we have to fight to get them on campus, which we shouldn't have to. But we're not going to let up anywhere on any campus. If we can win at UC Berkeley, we can win anywhere.
That's great. Thank you for having that fight and making sure you're defending students' ability to do that. You mentioned the Reagan Ranch earlier. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the recent fires in California. I know in following information on your own website that it was a scare recently. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah, fire started a week ago Monday, so Monday the 11th of October, just a short distance west. Really scary Monday and Tuesday because the winds were such that the big tanker planes and the helicopters that normally help contain fires couldn't get out. And so it got within a quarter mile. Thankfully, if anyone's ever been up there, they know how steep it is. And so maybe a little bit of God's grace and provincial hand winds came that day over the top of the mountain, over the top of the ranch, and kind of pushed it down towards the ocean front, which pushed it further east. But in the end, it went from a small fire near the Elisol Reservoir to over 17,000 acres. And it took well over 1,200, in the end, almost 2,000 firefighters to deal with it. And even as of a day ago, it was just at 78% containment. So it's still going. Our prayers for all the men and women in the fire service who are helping with that. But thank God it stayed away from our property. We did have a little bit of destruction in terms of we moved some ground on the property that we own across the street from the actual Reagan Ranch, and it tore up the road a little bit. But our other fire suppression equipment worked really, really well, which is why we're so thankful. It's just so many years worth of supporters who helped us put that in, because the way it was left when we took it over in '98 from the Reagans, made it very susceptible to fire.
Well, we are grateful for everybody who's battling that blaze and the people who are working for Young America's Foundation to keep it safe. I know that Heritage was honored earlier this year, as was Young America's Foundation, to have Vice President Mike Pence affiliate with both of our organizations to do some unique things. Yeah. In our case, he writes a regular column for the Daily Signal, and yours, he's just launched recently a new podcast. He's back in the business of being on air. Can you tell us about that relationship and what it means to have the former Vice President be part of your team?
It's really special. First week of November, he's going to be at the University of Iowa. On Veterans Day, he'll be at Texas A&M giving speeches. You're right, he's done functions, he's done conferences. He was at the Reagan Ranch where his family had been about 16 years prior when they were kids. Now they're full-grown adults. But the podcast, I hope people will listen in. The first one he did was on 9/11, before we talked about authenticity and fairness. Boy, that's personified. This is something that he's so good at. Before he was in Congress, Mike Pence was on the radio in Indiana and really has a knack for it. But more than talking, what you really can sense, and I think this is what draws particularly young people in, is he really takes the stories and lets them be the centerpiece, not himself. He really listens to what people are saying and talk about amazing stories. That first one, people should go back and listen to it, had a young woman whose father died on 9/11. Both parents were from Poland. It's part of the reason why they knew the difference between communism and freedom. So passionate, why she wanted to be connected to this podcast with the vice president. She is, as far as we can tell, was the last baby born after her father died in 9/11. So an unusual distinction now 20 years later. And then another young woman whose father was in the military. He left when she was born, and then after 9/11, he was drawn to be back in, and he unfortunately was killed in action in 2004, a few years after. Both of those young women talked to the vice president as part of this podcast, told their stories, which I was in the studio with them. It was hard to keep your eyes from leaking all over the place, but really, really powerful, and he continues to do great interviews like that on the issues of the day.
Well, I think it's a great podcast. We'll make sure that our listeners can find a link to it and encourage them to check it out. It's really fantastic that you're giving him the platform to be able to tell these stories. And as we know from his own columns at the Daily Signal, he's a great communicator.
He is indeed.
He is. Well, final question for you. I want to come full circle to where we started. 10 years ago, some of my colleagues here at the Heritage Foundation traveled to Wisconsin, actually to your home,
Absolutely,
to do an interview with you at the height of the budget debate that you were having and these protests that were going on in Madison. A year later, you faced a recall election. You were the first governor in American history to survive.
And the only sane one.
Recall. Looking back now, a decade later, what did those experiences teach you about political service and ultimately winning?
Well, and in a way, they're actually very relatable to the students we work with at Young America's Foundation, because I tell them, when they sent 100,000 protesters, remember, this wasn't for hours. This was for weeks, almost a month. They occupied our state capitol. I often joke the Occupy movement did not start on Wall Street. It started on my street in Madison, Wisconsin. But they were trying to intimidate us. They were trying to marginalize us. They were trying to minimize us, not just me and the death threats against me and my family, against our administration, our lawmakers and others. And then the recall was the ultimate cancel culture, right? And so I tell our students that we work with, particularly on college campuses, I can relate. The scale may be different, but they're dealing with the same things. They're trying to make young people feel intimidated, marginalized, as though they're all off on their own. One of the great things I hear at our conferences are young people who say, I had no idea other people think like I do. You probably get that with a lot of the interns and fellows that are involved here at Heritage, many of whom we swap and hire and work with along the way. But it just was a great reminder why reaching more people, connecting them with good, sound, conservative thought, and then not just the ideas, but then binding them together, that there's strength in numbers. And that the left's, really their goal has been for decades, is to intimidate, to marginalize, to make us feel like we're out on a limb all by ourselves. And we realize, no, we're closer to the trunk than people think. And there's a lot more people deeply rooted with these strong, all-American traditional ideas. To that extent, I think the more we do that, the more we remind people that, the better off we're all going to be.
You're certainly right. Well, if you want to learn more, again, it's Young America's Foundation. The website is yaf.org. Governor Scott Walker, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Thanks so much for watching this video. Be sure to hit the subscribe button so you never miss new content from the Daily Signal.